We will begin the afternoon sections with the presentation and discussion on micro-credential, but from honorable European speakers. May I now introduce you our moderator of this session, Mr. Michael Hörig, the Chairman, Program Director for German Academic Exchange Service, known as DAAD. And please welcome our in-person speaker, Ms. Magalie Soenen from Ministry of Education and Training, Flanders, Belgium, and also the two speakers from virtual Zoom meeting. The first one is Ms. Kinga Szuly from European Commission and Ms. Thérèse Zhang Pulkowski from European University Association. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the guest speaker and our moderator.
Well, thank you very much, and also a warm good morning to our speakers in Brussels, both. Hello, Kinga. Hello, Thérèse. I can see you on the screen. The others can see you on very big screens, so you're part of the audience at the moment. We're sitting here on stage with Magalie. I'm sure that we all know each other, so it's a bit awkward that for people from Brussels discuss with each other on two continents. But this is the purpose of this session. We would like to share with our Thai friends and colleagues and the colleagues in ASEAN the European experience and the European policies on micro-credentials. And I think we have quite interesting things to share. But before we do that, I would like to just mention to you back in Brussels that the session from this morning, which was extremely interesting on the situation in Thailand, and the presentations were all filmed, and so you can watch them later if you want. We will share them with you, and then you have also the impressions from this morning's discussion here in Bangkok. Now we have three speakers in this session. We would like to share with you the overall policy developments, so the European approach to micro-credentials, which will be shared by Kinga from the European Commission. We will then turn to Magalie for a presentation on a EU-funded project called MicroBall on micro-credentials and the Bologna process, and then finally turn to the universities with Thérèse, who works for the European University Association. So that's the plan for the next 90 minutes. And without much further ado, I would like to ask Kinga to address our audience, which is in the room here in Bangkok, but also joining us on Zoom.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I would like to say a few words about the initiative of the European Commission on micro-credentials. I have a PowerPoint presentation I will share. I will try to share it. I need to put it on slideshow. Yes. I hope you can see it, and I hope you can hear me. Is it okay? Okay, I think you see. Is it true that you see a big gray area?
Yes, that's true. Maybe we can move the gray area. So
is it better now?
Now it's better, yes. There's a gray area on top, but maybe that doesn't matter too much. Okay.
Yes. Okay, this is my Zoom panel that you can see on gray. So the European approach to micro-credentials is an initiative of two commissioners because it is an area which overlaps two big policy areas of the European Commission. One is on employment and skills development, and the other one is education and training. It is also a policy which is highlighted in the Digital Education Action Plan, because all the digital developments in the latest years supported very much the development of micro-credentials worldwide. Why it became a top priority for the Commission? It's clear that the growing number of people need to update their knowledge, skills, and competencies for the green and digital transition, especially after the COVID-19 recovery. So to reach the targets, what has been proposed by the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, to have at least 60% of adults participating in training every year, and have at least 78% of the population in employment, we need people to update and upgrade their skills. We see the number of micro-credentials raising globally, but there are certain uncertainties around micro-credentials. The value and understanding is not always clear. There is a wide range of providers with very different background, from education, training, private sector, and there are questions on transparency, uptake and quality of micro-credentials. So based on this, the Commission defined the objectives for micro-credentials. It should enable people to acquire new knowledge, skills, and competencies for the changing labor market and society. It needs to support the preparedness of providers of micro-credentials to enhance the quality, transparency, and flexibility of the learning offer. And it also fosters inclusiveness and equal opportunities, contributing to the achievement of resilience, social fairness, and prosperity for all. Based on this, the defined scope of our initiatives can cover all kinds of providers. It sets out the definition, guidance, and design for micro-credentials. It aims to complement education and training, so not change degrees and qualifications, but complement them. And it is proposing to establish a common European approach to the ongoing and emerging provisions of micro-credentials. Based on intensive consultations with stakeholders, member states, experts, the proposed definition for this European approach of micro-credentials is the following. Micro-credentials means the record of the learning outcomes that a learner has acquired following a small volume of learning. These learning outcomes have been assessed against transparent and clearly defined criteria. So it's very important that micro-credentials are linked to both the record, so both the qualifications that received at the end, the certification. Also, it refers to the learning outcome, so the process of learning, which is a small volume of learning. It's intentional that in the European definition, there is no stated volume of this, what is small, because we wanted to leave the door open. We would like to have a definition which is flexible enough. It is also crucial that these learning outcomes are assessed at the end. So there is an act of assessment at the end of the process. So as an explanation, the definition also states that learning experiences leading to micro-credentials are designed to provide the learner with specific knowledge, skills, and competencies that respond to societal, personal, cultural, or labor market needs. So the definition is not narrowed down to only labor market relevance. Micro-credentials are owned by the learner, can be shared, and are portable. And they may be standalone or combined into larger credentials, but not to full degrees. That's not the aim of our initiative, to combine micro-credentials to a full degree. They are underpinned by quality assurance following agreed standards in the relevant sector or area of activity. The European approach also defines European standard elements for the micro-credentials. So it should cover the identification of the learner, the title of the micro-credential, the region of the issuer, the awarding body. This all aims at providing enough transparency for the micro-credentials. So both for further learning and for employment purposes, it should be clear for those who do these micro-credentials what this micro-credential actually provides and what does it signals. It also defines principles for the design and issuance of micro-credentials. These principles are linked to quality, transparency, relevance, valid assessment, learning pathways, recognition. It should be portable, learner-centered, authentic, and provide information and guidance. We defined recommendations to member states in order to support the take-up and provision of these micro-credentials. So we request member states to adopt the definition, to adopt the standard element and the principles for the design and issuance of micro-credentials. We also propose them different ways to develop an ecosystem for micro-credentials and how to support the delivering on the potential of micro-credentials. The Commission also provides support for implementation of all these for member states. So for the development of an ecosystem for micro-credentials, it's important to adapt, apply, and develop quality assurance mechanisms for micro-credentials. It is more open for education institutions, but private providers should also have a way to quality assure their micro-credentials. We recommend to support the use of skills intelligence systems for micro-credentials, establish and publish course catalogs of micro-credentials, and integrate micro-credentials in national qualifications, frameworks, and systems where relevant. For delivering on the potential of micro-credentials, it's very important to mainstream micro-credentials in education, training, and skills policies. So it's not only encouraging in national catalogs, but to improve access, to support the transition from upper secondary to vet or tertiary education, to improve digital skills, or to support environmental sustainability. It's also important to promote micro-credentials to have a positive impact on the regional economy, to support continuous professional developments for teachers and trainers, to be able to deliver high-quality micro-credentials, and to prompt the transfer of latest research findings into learning opportunities. Finally, but not least, it's also important to challenge gender and other discriminatory stereotypes while exploring the use of micro-credentials. Finally, the Commission also provides support for the development of micro-credentials. It will adopt the different existing European tools so that micro-credentials can be fully utilized, and supports technical implementation. The Europass portal will offer the possibility to store and share micro-credentials for individuals. We support exchange of best practices and discussion among member states and stakeholders, and we also provide research data and data collection to support evidence-based policymaking on microcredentials. And that's all what I wanted to share now, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kinga. Do stay with us. The questions will come after the presentations. All participants can post questions through the channels that we have foreseen. There's a Mentimeter tool set up. I will see it on my screen once questions come in. But for now, I would like to, you mentioned, Kinga, already the implementation support of microcredentials by the European Commission. I think that's a good cue for Magalie's presentation, because she will speak about the microball project to give you an insight how this type of policy support could actually look like.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present to all of you here the results of our European project. So now we have just heard from Kinga the policies and the things that they are developing and supporting in the EU context. Now let me take you to the context of the European higher education area, which comprises 49 countries, so which is a larger area in which we worked within the Bologna process. So the project has run since March 2020 and was finished a couple of months ago in March 2022. And in this project, we researched the link between microcredentials and the Bologna key commitments. For those of you who are not familiar with the Bologna key commitments, there are 3 key commitments, being quality assurance, recognition, and qualification frameworks and ECTS. So how microcredentials are linked to these 3 commitments, that is what we have investigated in the project. So very briefly about the project, it was coordinated by the Flemish Ministry of Education and Training, and we did this together with the Ministry of Education and Culture of Finland, CIMEA, which is the ENIC-NARIC Center of Italy, and also together with the European University Association and ENQA. The next speaker, Thérèse, will also refer to some of the results because she's also from EUA, and she will also refer to some results of a survey that we have done. We also had the help of a number of European experts to the project. So what was our aim? I already briefly mentioned it. We looked at the key commitments and how microcredentials can make use of or can be used, and the link with those 3 topics. But what we also wanted to do was to raise awareness among national governments in the European higher education area. Because at the time that we applied for the project, which was already in 2019, microcredentials were not such a hot topic yet as it is now. Now you hear about microcredentials in all policy levels in universities, but in 2019 it was still much more an emerging topic. So it was really necessary, I thought, at that time to put this also on the agenda of national governments, because we already saw in 2019 a lot of initiatives popping up at university level. So it was really necessary that also national governments, national policy also reflected on this emerging field. We also wanted to formulate recommendations and create a European framework for microcredentials. We just heard from the European Commission that they also have created a European framework, and of course we also looked for synergies. We worked together also within the EU and within our context of the European higher education area, in order not to have any conflicts, but rather to complement the work in these 2 areas. Very briefly on the structure and the timeline of the project. So we kicked off our conference in August, September 2020, and we had the privilege to have also Dr. Bundit from the previous session also as a keynote speaker in our conference. So we already tried there to have this link also between Asia and Europe. Right after that, we started with 3 working groups on these 3 topics: quality assurance, recognition, and qualification frameworks. And as you can see, we had a lot of participants, a lot of representatives from European countries taking part in these 3 topics. Furthermore, next to working in these working groups and discussing among each other, we thought it would also be very useful to have a survey among all EHEA countries. So EHEA stands for European Higher Education Area. And this was also, well, this was not planned initially in the project, but it was really necessary to do that because of COVID. We had these working groups, but if you're around a table, around a virtual table with 60 or 70 participants, it's very hard to get information from all countries around a table. So the survey was really a kind of a state of play at that moment in all the EHEA countries. And furthermore, then we worked afterwards on the recommendation and the framework. Now, let me go back now to this survey. So what I said, it was the idea to gain a state of play, a first moment in time, a reference point in time about the state of play in autumn 2020. We targeted all the members of the Bologna follow-up group. So these are representatives of the national authorities, of the ministries in the countries of the European higher education area. And we had from 35 countries input for this survey. So it was really very worthwhile to do this extra task in the project. So if you would be interested, I have put there the download link so you can have a look online to the results of this survey. Then after that, based on the survey results and also on the discussions in the working groups and the desk research that we did in the beginning of the project, we put together a joint publication of 34 recommendations, especially on QA, recognition and qualification frameworks and ECTS. So the target group for these recommendations are again our countries in the European higher education area and also the stakeholder organizations. We, on the other hand, also used the microball recommendations as input for the consultation that was, the open consultation that was going on at that moment by the European Commission in order to give input also to them for their further work. So also these recommendations, you can find them online on our webpage. Now, if I go more in depth in these recommendations, what have we taken up in there? Well, first we had some recommendations on transversal themes. So we thought that the development of micro-credentials was an opportunity to rethink higher education's role in lifelong learning. We also said that we should create awareness and also a common agreement on what a micro-credential is. And linked to that also the common format, what the Commission also referred to. We had some recommendations also on legislation at national level and on the digitalization part. Furthermore, we also found, especially from the discussions in the working groups, that there is much need for peer support and peer exchange between countries within the European higher education area, but also what we are doing here today with other parts of the world, with other world regions. And in doing that, we need to involve all actors. It's not only the higher education institutions, it's not only the national authorities, but as we heard also this morning, industries, the student organizations, we have to really involve all actors. And for these different actors, also for alternative providers, etc., we need to develop some guidelines or some guidebooks. This is also one of our recommendations on which we will work now in the coming years. And then if we go really into the Bologna key commitments, then we have these recommendations on specifically on quality assurance, recognition and qualification frameworks. So I'll go deeper into that in a few minutes. Now, what I mentioned just before here about the common format and the common agreement, that's linked to the definition. So we also had a look at a definition of a micro-credential. We used one as a kind of working format since the beginning, of 2020. And this working definition kind of developed throughout the project, and we came up with a very short definition at the end, saying that a micro-credential is a certified small volume of learning. And that's it. That's where we stopped at that moment, our definition. And it's also not in contradiction to what the European Commission has developed as definition. But here in the framework of the Microbol project, we really focused on higher education. And that's a difference also with the definition and the framework of the Commission, because there they focus on the whole of education, also the field of work. So they have a broader scope, and in Microbol we really focused only on higher education. So the parts that follow here, you could say it's part of the definition, but it's more like what's the purpose of a micro-credential. So they are designed to provide the learner with specific knowledge, skills and competences. That's the same sentence more or less like the final definition of the Commission. So it gives more explanation, let's say. It's not really the definition itself, according to us in our project, but it's more about the purpose, about the use, how micro-credentials can be used. We say that they are owned by the learner, they are portable, they can be combined, so they can be stackable, etc. So this is more the extra explanation that we give on a certain micro-credential. I will not go into detail on all of this. You will get the presentation later on. But what is important for the use is that micro-credentials can be seen as a way to tailor the learning offer and to make visible the knowledge, skills and competences acquired. So this is an important one, I think. Alongside our definition, we also have, also similar like the European Commission, a number of constitutive elements, information that we need on this micro-credential to know what it's worth, to make sure that it can be recognized, that we know that the quality assurance is there. And if we then have a look at these three Bologna key commitments, let's focus first on the one of quality assurance. So our basic idea concerning the quality assurance of micro-credentials is that the European standards and guidelines that we have in the Bologna process, they apply to all higher education offered. So that means all regular degree programs, but also micro-credentials if they are offered in higher education institution. So they apply to all provision in whatever format, duration or mode of delivery. And the primary responsibility for the quality of this provision lies within the higher education institutions. So therefore, our recommendation within the Microbol project is that all micro-credentials should be subject to internal QA, independently of the external QA approach in the country. We say that because in Europe we have in different countries different methods of quality assurance. We have program evaluation, we have institutional evaluation, But here for micro-credentials, we really think that the institutional evaluation is a much better fit for micro-credentials than program accreditation, which would be much too extensive and much too, too much work, let's say, to do that for short courses. We also say that we can design a set of key considerations on micro-credentials, like a kind of guidelines on how to use the European standards and guidelines in the framework of micro-credentials. And we also further want to explore in collaboration with alternative providers, including companies, if and how QA procedures that we already have should be adapted for the provision of micro-credentials if there is a partnership, a cooperation between these alternative providers and the higher education institutions. What is also important is that we need to include learners in all steps of development, but also in the implementation of micro-credentials. And that might be not always that easy, because in our countries we have learners in curriculum commissions, in quality assurance processes of regular degree programs, but their students study 2 or 3 or 4 years or longer in the same study field. For a micro-credential, the time is much shorter, so it's not so easy maybe to also include learners in all these steps. But anyway, we should try to strive for that. Another thing is that we should provide clear information on the quality assurance mechanisms for the awarded micro-credentials. So if a student takes a micro-credential, that it's also clear afterwards if he wants to have it recognized for another degree or for an employer, what quality assurance mechanisms were there in this micro-credential. We also would like to have official registers of micro-credential providers on one hand, and of lists of micro-credentials on offer in the different countries. And we would like to see if they can be included in the database of ECAR, the European Quality Assurance Register. Okay, so then let's go to recognition. Here we talked about the link with the Lisbon Recognition Convention, and we say that we should make explicit to what extent micro-credentials can fall within the scope of this recognition convention. We should clarify what could be the legal ground for academic recognition and explore the needs for text to support a fast and fair recognition. Furthermore, we should also explore the possibility of recognition agreements among education providers at regional but also cross-regional international level. And thirdly, we should consider the possibility to include a chapter on micro-credentials in the revised version of the European Area of Recognition Manual. Recognition of prior learning, it has also been mentioned already this morning. We should use validation of learning outcomes from non-formal and informal learning only in cases where a formal micro-credential is absent, or when it does not provide enough reliable evidence. And we should develop procedures for the validation of learning outcomes from these non-formal and informal learning. And last but not least, we should also explore the possibility of defining opportunities for training and experience sharing on the recognition of non-formal and informal qualifications, validation of learning outcomes. Now, if we go to the third and last topic, the qualification frameworks, we should discuss things on European and national level at the same time, because the European discussion on micro-credentials can also have impact on national solutions. So it's important that we move forward on national and international level concerning qualification frameworks. And the general idea is that micro-credentials should be included in the national qualification frameworks when possible, because this third key commitment, the qualification frameworks, we saw and we learned from the discussion that this in many countries is still the most difficult part. Therefore, we also think that guidelines and common principles for implementing micro-credentials should be developed at national and European level to help countries, to help higher education institutions. If we look at ECTS, so the European Credit Transfer System, we should ensure that the ECTS Users Guide that we have in the European higher education area, that it is well known and that it's also correctly followed by the institutions, and also in the case of micro-credentials. And also here we say that it could be good to have some extra explanations, some extra guidelines on how to use the ECTS principles in the framework of micro-credentials. And again, here on the topic of ECTS, we should encourage cooperation between higher education institutions and other education sectors, as well as private providers. So again, sitting around the table with all stakeholders is important. The way forward, because the project now ended, but of course this was not the end, it was rather the beginning of everything, because we defined what a micro-credential is and we defined the recommendations, but now we have to take up those recommendations and do something with it. So this is what we are also going to do. So within the Bologna framework, we have thematic peer groups on these three Bologna key commitments, and the topic of micro-credentials is taken up in these three groups. So for the next 3 years, we have new projects, follow-up projects, in which we will further work on the three topics and on the implementation of our recommendations. And within those peer groups, we will create these opportunities for peer support, exchange of practices. We will have further national discussions, develop those guidebooks, those guidelines that we mentioned, and support the development of a clear policy framework with transparent standards. So if you want to have more information, all our deliverables are available on the website, and of course you can also contact us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Magalie, for providing us with this extensive input. And if you are not sure whether you've understood everything that Magalie said, I'm sure she is available for coffee breaks and dinners and lunches to explain further on the details of the European higher education area and what comes with it. I think it's interesting, and until this session, and that's why traveling is sometimes interesting to get new insights, the relationship between the European recommendations from the European Commission and the Microbol project, which was funded by the European Commission but goes beyond that, but in a specific sector of higher education. How does that relate to each other? And maybe one question for you, Magalie, to consider, or at least a clarification from my side. You said micro-credential as qualifications. Now, this morning I figured from the discussions in Thailand, a micro-credential is everything but a qualification. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Well, it's a credential, so it's a certificate that you get. So you could consider that as a qualification. And we also see that in Europe we have a lot of different kinds of micro-credentials, because this morning it was also mentioned, or in one of the questions, someone said that higher education is focusing on the full degrees, etc. And also, this person was asking the question, what about these micro-credentials? Is this something new? But I see in many higher education institutions that it's not really something new. It's kind of short learning programs that already existed, but not under the name of a micro-credential. it was, or it is still part of the lifelong learning offer in higher education institutions, and it does not lead to a bachelor or a master degree, but they give another kind of certificate, another kind of qualification. And what's in a name? Now we can put everything under the terminology of a micro-credential, but we see a lot of different types of qualifications that fall under our definition. So I think there's a lot of food still for thought and for exchange on that.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Indeed, more food for thought and more topics for discussions in conferences like these. So more work to be done. But now let's turn to the stakeholder perspective. The European University Association participated in this project described by Magalie, but probably also has its own view on the purpose, usefulness, and uptake of micro-credentials and in European higher education. So, Thérèse, please enlighten us.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, all right, because I feel I have a few seconds of difference with my image on screen, so it's fine if you can hear me. Whoa, big challenge, huh? I have to enlighten you. I'll try to complement mostly the views that Kinga on behalf of the European Commission and also Magalie already provided. And in order to do that properly, I will try first to share my screen, just a little second. Just a second, I try to put it. Can you see it?
We can see it, yes. But I think you still need to go in full screen mode.
Yes, but it doesn't allow me to go on full screen, so I don't know why it doesn't work. I promised to the audience, we actually rehearsed yesterday. We had a technical test. And of course, it always works fine during technical tests. But then, yeah. All right. Perhaps we can live with that because I don't manage to put it on full screen with the button. So I'm afraid we'll have to live with that. All right. What I'm going to try to do is to provide you a complementary view of what has already been explained about micro-credentials and the way the policy framework is currently being developed in Europe. Just a second. Yes. You can see it moving, right? And I think the first thing to mention is probably that indeed it takes place in a relatively recent context of policy discussions mentioned in Bologna process communiques, but also as part of the European Commission's work in the past years as Kinga develops, and in the context of general attention also granted to the overall issue of developing skills at European level and at national labor markets level, of course, as well. So this work on micro-credential has started more or less in the years that Magalie mentioned, a bit before probably 19, but also it has increased in intensity in the years 2020 and onwards. And in June of this year, the European Council also adopted a recommendation on a European approach to micro-credentials in lifelong learning and for employability. What is important to perhaps underline from my perspective here is that we have this important work that has been done and has been done also incredibly by the Microbel project on focusing on higher education. But this is also a topic that is not only embracing higher education, but education, training, and even social and employment policies in general. And so also encompassing all types of other providers, let's say, than higher education institutions. So it's also part of, let's say, a policy continuum and a policy momentum at the same time. I'm trying to move my slide. I'm not sure if it works.
Thérèse,
Yes?
got a cue from our technicians. Why don't you try to share it again? It might work now.
Okay, just a second. So normally I'm back on your screen. I'll try.
You don't have to start from scratch. We listen to you, but we can now maybe watch your slides in a different way.
Just a second. No, dear technician, I still cannot use the slide, the full screen button. It just doesn't work. Slide control, not sure why. But you can see the slides, right?
Yes and no. I mean, I have a separate screen where I can see the slides, but the audience can't see the slides at the moment. So can you take control of the Zoom?
All right. Then I think I'll need some technical assistance here. I can stop sharing, but basically all my comments on the PowerPoint itself froze, so
well,
I cannot.
You just have to tell us which slide you're on, and then we can show it properly.
All right. So I'm on the third slide.
There you go. How about that?
That's the magic stuff. All right, perfect. All right. So, dear technician, I guess I'll just tell you next slide when I will need to move. Is that all right? Yes? All right. No, yeah, that was a test. Could you return to the previous slide, please? Yes, thank you very much. So I won't go in detail on that one because all kinds of definitions, and Magalie especially also explains the point about having a definition already. I just wanted to perhaps underline here these consensus that there is definitely on the part that it should be a small volume of learning, and then a few other features related to quality assurance, and also to provide the learner with specific knowledge, skills, and competences. From the European institution side, there is also a stress on the fact that it should be owned by the learner, of course, and can be shared and portable. Next slide, please. Yes. So for higher education institutions, as Magalie already hinted on, definitely micro-credentials are not a new phenomenon. It might be new clothes for the emperor. It might be seen as a new way of basically addressing and putting under the spotlight all kinds of, let's say, non-degree education provision that may have already existed at institutions. So they do not really substitute, but complement. We should really see that as an opportunity for complementing conventional higher education qualifications and degrees in the way that they're understood also in the Bologna context, so with a degree structure and all that. And I think my important point here would be that they should be seen definitely as part of a lifelong learning continuum and continuous professional development, and as an entry mechanism as well to a degree program. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes. So under the Microball project, UA conducted a short text research and highlighted a bit the different stakeholders' perspective here. And we already heard about the policymakers' perspective, which is to increase the need for upskilling and reskilling, and also for flexible and inclusive learning path. From the learner's perspective, there is of course the idea of this entry mechanism, entrance door into a degree program, but also a way to acquire interdisciplinary knowledge and skills, and also a way to more flexible planning in their studies. And the employer's perspective is that micro-credentials, of course, can help them to better understand specific skills, professional profession skills of a prospective employee, and may serve as on-job training. From the higher education institutions perspective, it is definitely a way to also address lifelong learning at institutions, but in a multifaceted way. Higher education institutions might provide continuous education in a targeted and specialized way. So basically providing more targeted professional training, for instance, so not initial but postgraduate training, but also as a way to increase their commitment towards social inclusion, diversity of needs, and increase visibility and reputation sometimes for institutions. It may also be a way to increase their responsiveness to students, to labor market demand, and last but not least, experiment perhaps with new ways to teach, with new pedagogies, technologies, and experiment with other ways, let's say, to organize education provision, for example, in preparing joint education provision, in seeking ways to collaborate with other institutions to provide transnational education, but at a smaller scale than, for example, a joint program, which is already something relatively big, relatively heavy also to carry out. So micro-credentials may be a good a good and easier way, a lighter way, let's say, to experiment with new ways to offer education. Next slide, please. So for higher education institutions, as we already mentioned, micro-credentials are definitely not new, and they are one of the key providers of micro-credentials and drivers of innovation in this area, but with their level of institutional autonomy, and it also may depend on the profile of the institution, what kind of micro-credentials they would target depending on this. It is what we have, let's say, anecdotal evidence about is that it is there is also a question, and probably an even follow-up conversation to have here about the relation between micro-credentials and the institution's mission and vision. So it may not always be like a super strategic intake from institution side for micro-credentials, but also a more operational intake from their side. Let's say they would have some, but they would not have some necessarily connected to a strong priority on this strategic plan. So you may have several ways for higher education institutions to offer them, and also to profile the way they offer micro-credentials. Can I have the next slide, please? All right. In 2020, 2 years ago, we conducted at the UA a survey about digitally enhanced learning and teaching at European higher education institutions. So the survey was not dedicated to micro-credentials as such. We had about 360 participants, 368 to be exact, from the whole European education, higher education area. I just would like to show this slide because it also crosses path with what we are currently exploring. If we're talking about how much of micro-credentials and how much of these is present already, at European institutions, we had 50% of our respondents answering that they do already offer short online courses that are non-degree related, but lead to certificates, micro-credentials, badges, all kinds of ways to basically certify and provide a kind of award. We have also about half of institutions that stated one of the main motivations for offering MOOCs, massive online open courses, which are one of the ways to offer micro-credentials, is to reach out to new learner groups. And we also have about half of institutions that answered the survey that think short courses mainly serve lifelong learners. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, and here there is this is part of several discussions that I think are still ongoing and need to be also further explored. Credit-bearing micro-credentials versus non-credit-bearing micro-credentials. I think we are, as Magalie mentioned, in the European framework that has been prepared and recommended, we are going towards a mentioning of credit when it comes to micro-credentials provided by higher education institutions. It's quite important actually to not create a kind of two-speed system within the same institution in this regard. And this is one of the reasons why this is important. So higher education institutions provide micro-credentials as separate learning modules, but also as part of a conventional degree and their lifelong learning provision. And you can have different modes of delivery in face-to-face, of course, physical, but also online, hybrids, and blended. But I guess some of the other more traditional education provision is also subject to nowadays in the aftermath of the pandemic. So can I have the next slide, please? So if we give an overview of this now at European higher education area level, and these are the results of the survey in 35 countries from the European higher education area that Magalie also mentioned before and was conducted in the microbal context. Micro-credentials, we can see that it's offered in 21 countries. They are being developed in another 3, so it's quite a number already. And one of the main conclusions of that study was also to understand that what constitutes micro-credentials varies across countries. The most common form is course unit within a degree program, MOOCs, special purpose awards. National legislation allows for the provision of micro-credentials in 22 countries, and among them 8 reported that there are specific regulations concerning micro-credentials, but 14 of them that there is no such national legislation. This also means that they find a way to navigate through existing provision provided by national legislation for their micro-credentials in a way. 12 countries emphasize that there is need to regulate and integrate them properly, and also 22 countries consider that micro-credentials are a way to make higher education more flexible, more inclusive in the future. These seem to be the key words that keep coming back again and again, also throughout our presentations. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is just an overview provided by the same survey on the examples, on the kinds of formats of micro-credentials that higher education institutions can offer. As I already mentioned, mostly under the form of modules and course units as part of the grid, also as MOOCs, but it could also be special purpose awards, additional courses, all kinds of certificates, postgraduate education, modules or course units that are part of the grid program, but could also be standalone, and all kinds of other lifelong learning provision. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes. So as conclusions here, and I will finish on this one, what we can see is that there is a diversity of formats, let's say, for providing micro-credentials at higher education institutions. This should be seen as a strength, definitely. And the European Framework for Micro-Credentials aims would really contribute to increase this clarity and transparency, which currently seem to be lacking. Actually, the word currently applied rather to the time of the survey, so by 2021. But it also needs to leave room for diversity and creativity. So there is a fine balance to find between not being overly regulated, need for flexibility, but also this real need for transparency and also some room for experimentation. Micro-credentials present an opportunity for higher education institutions, definitely, to respond in a more rapid, in a more flexible way, in a more swift way to societal demands, to labor market demands, but also a way and opportunity, to innovate, to reach out to new audiences, and also perhaps to experiment with all kinds of education provision that may become easier in that context. For example, when it comes to joint education provision, so transnational cooperation in education. Will they revolutionize higher education? I'm not quite sure about that. Which is certain is that while not totally new at higher education institutions, the renewed way we converse about them, we talk about them, is also a conversation about basically the future of non-degree education as such, and how we would like to seize this opportunity to basically do a bit better and offer something that is complementary, but also something that addresses diverse needs, and the more and more diverse needs of our students, of the learners, and of society in general. I think that's all I wanted to say here. The last slide is just a thank you slide, if I remember well, but we can display it. And thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for the technical issues, and I look forward to further discussion with you and the audience, and also our panelists, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thérèse, for complementing the discussions started by Kinga and the presentation by Magalie. One thing that struck me now, bringing together the discussions from this morning and your 3 presentations, is I think there's a certain skepticism towards the disruptive nature of micro-credentials in Europe, at least from the presentations that I heard, whereas this morning we talked a lot about the transformative character of micro-credentials and the possible impact on higher education system by disentangling and looking differently at volumes of learning. So I think that's an interesting takeaway from this. Maybe it's because the discussion in Southeast Asia is in a different stage than where the European discussions are currently. Maybe it's because we are indeed seeing a large uptake of micro-credentials in higher education sector and therefore maybe also heavy influence by higher education providers in shaping what micro-credentials could be. I'm not sure, but this is really something to reflect upon, and which I see also a certain need for further dialogue between the regions, for instance, because I think this is, if we move forward towards implementing micro-credentials, this could be definitely one of the topics. Now, do I see any questions from the audience before I take up questions from the Zoom call or of my own list of questions that I could ask? Does anybody want to take the floor here? Otherwise, I would like to ask Kinga maybe to elaborate a little bit more on how the European Commission intends to seek synergies on the one hand with other existing European initiatives on how micro-credentials could be used, and maybe also, because I believe it's part of also the European approach, to look at what does it mean in terms of social equity. How do we address and how do we achieve that micro-credentials actually can benefit learners that come from non-traditional backgrounds or non-academic backgrounds? Kinga.
Thank you very much. Yes, there are a number of initiatives that are linked up with this Council recommendation, which has been adopted in June this year. Together with this, an individual learning accounts Council recommendation was also adopted. The goal of these individual learning accounts is to collect training and adult learning entitlements for individuals, and these individuals will be able to use these entitlements as credits, for example, to acquire learning that is quality assured and has a proper assessment and integrated in the learning market and the labor market. So this is a very important aspect to support the uptake of micro-credentials. Of course, these individual learning accounts could be used for all kinds of upskilling and reskilling of the opportunities, not only micro-credentials, and micro-credentials are not only those that are supported by these individual learning accounts. But still, these are very important synergies for providing support for uptake of micro-credentials. In the European Strategy for Universities, which has also been adopted this year, there are also different innovative learning opportunities, like, for example, for the green and digital transition, where we foresee micro-credentials based on European approach to be integrated. So it is indeed a work that has already been started, but it's ongoing. Regarding the inclusion and equity aspects linked to micro-credentials, this is a very important objective of this initiative, to support it. And the European Commission is supporting it with financial means from the Erasmus Plus program, but also for the different other funding programs of the EU. So both the uptake and the provision of micro-credentials, but of course the most important is to have this support at the member state level, so at national level. To support non-traditional learners, it's important to have proper recognition also of their previous learning, and also the support of the recognition of these micro-credentials for the labor market and for further learning is crucial in order to have a more diverse and wider type of audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kinga. Maybe to add, I think you both, Magalie and you, emphasized the need to provide transparency and information on the provider. I think one of the aspects, of course, in terms of social equity is also that the learners know what they are signing up to, especially if they pay for the micro-credential, then they need to know whether it's actually really something that will bring them forward in their learning path, or whether it's actually an empty shell and we don't know what's behind it. So there's a certain risk in that, but I think the transparency focus of the European approach is definitely something to use. So Hasman, I'll come to you in a second. Let me just finish one aspect of the strength of discussion, because I hear from the chat also two comments that relate to activities that SHARE conducted in terms of training and informing about the Europass initiative, and the question on how Asian institutions can get the possibility to actually enlist and use security seals for Europass provision in enlisting in Europass so that the learners can actually use credentials that they've obtained in Southeast Asia for their Europass portfolio. I'm sure that's is something that we and should communicate to DG Employment, that is, to my knowledge, in charge of this. So maybe, Kinga, you could, if you have a regular exchange with them, maybe this is something to take to them, that of course learning takes place worldwide, and training providers in other world regions might have an interest in actually aligning their technological requirements to what the European standard is for that Europass. So now I have Hasman as a question, and then I would like to go to Magalie for a question of my own. Hasman.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Hasman from Malaysia. The EU's or EC's approach to micro-credential is focused on higher education sector. Are there other initiatives outside the higher education sector which also touches on the non-traditional providers? It may be under work skills with respect to employers, industries, and associations, and this may be the alternative providers to higher education. And whether there is any attempt to try and, I think Michael mentioned that earlier just now, attempt to harmonize these things as you're working towards a common definition, quality assurance. What about the other sector, the non-higher education sector? Is there any attempt to try and bring them along on the micro-credential journey?
Thank you very much, Hasman. Especially the non-higher education sector offering higher education level credentials. That would be probably the topic to talk about. Magalie, and then maybe Kinga or Thérèse.
So very briefly, within the Microball project, we focused on offer by higher education institutions or recognized by higher education institutions. So when we started the project in March 2020, we found out that the topic is so huge, so broad, that for the sake of the project that we had to narrow down. So we really focused on offer by higher education institutions, and also for the part of recognition, other qualifications that could be from other alternative providers, but recognized by higher education institutions. We decided not to go into detail on cooperation with alternative providers at that moment, because we first wanted to have things more or less sorted out for our higher education institutions level. And now that we have done so, that we have this framework, that we have these recommendations, in the next couple of years we can further work on the relationship and the cooperation with other providers as well. But we haven't done so yet.
Any other comments, Kinga or Thérèse?
From the European Commission point of view, it's clear that we should also address private providers, so not only higher education. So this is a joint initiative with the Employment Directorate General of the Commission. So we aim to draw a framework, a European approach, which covers both fields. Of course, there are very important differences between micro-credentials provided by higher education and by private providers. First of all, the issue of quality assurance is much more and much more clearly defined at higher education level than for private providers. So there are a multiplicity of quality assurance possibilities for private providers, while for higher education in Europe, overwhelmingly the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance that guides this process, which allows a broad overview and allows transparency and allows everybody to understand how quality assurance procedures work for higher education. So and this helps recognition of these micro credentials. So for private providers, it's a more a broader issue where more work is needed at a European level as well.
Thérèse, do you want to add something, or shall we include you in the next question?
Yeah, I just would like to agree with the two previous speakers in many regards. Indeed, micro-credentials is not the trademark, so of course we will have to play with, and in a transparent way, with different types of providers here. I just would like to add to what Kinga said regarding quality assurance. Indeed, what is in a way easier for higher education institutions is that we have this commonly agreed consensual framework at European level for quality assurance through the European standards and guidelines. But how to enforce, for example, ESGs on companies, you can't really. So there is a lot to discuss still in terms of how to put things together. Let's say transparency is definitely also key in this ongoing conversation.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I want to go to a topic that is, well, first of all, maybe to add on, this morning we talked a lot about co-creation between industry and higher education providers of micro-credentials. So it's not just the recognition of degrees offered or credentials offered by private companies, but it's also about developing new things. And the big question mark there would be maybe the quality assurance systems in place in higher education would not be necessarily fit for purpose for doing this type of work. So that's a big question mark from my side for the discussion. But actually I want to pick up another topic that I think Magalie, you said, and you touched upon the credit transfer system, ECTS, which was developed for Erasmus Plus in the beginning and then for credit accumulation, and has a set of standards and rules and guidelines, users guide, and is to some extent a bit of a rigid framework on how much learning you need to put into one credit. So the definition, I think, is 25 to 30 hours of learning for one credit. Now my question to Magalie and to the other colleagues would be, is that fit for purpose for small volume of learning? Because a small volume of learning, in my opinion, could be easily less than 25 hours of learning. So what do? Offer 20% of one credit? Magalie?
Yes, well, that's something that we also discussed within the European higher education area, within our working groups. And also, Kinga can confirm also at EU level, there has been a lot of discussion on the size of a micro-credential. I think first we need to divide between micro-credentials and micro-credits. Micro-credits is really a very small credit, like what you say, it could be 1/5 of a credit. So that's the terminology micro-credits. If we speak about micro-credentials, in our framework, in the microbal framework, we defined a micro-credential between 1 ECTS, so 1 European credit, and the upper level is less than a full degree. Which means in Europe we have normally for a model trajectory 60 ECTS for one academic year. So that would mean that a micro-credential can be between 1 and 59 ECTS. That's how we defined it. We didn't really put that in the definition itself, but we want to have it as broad as possible, because it was also mentioned, I think, in Thérèse's presentation. We need to offer the flexibility, and we saw that in those 49 countries of the European higher education area, already a lot of different initiatives are popping up in universities. So if you put the range of the size of a micro-credential too narrow, then the question is raised, what with the others? What with the others? If you say it can only be maximum 30, then what you do with a 40 ECTS micro degree that is offered in a university. So we kept it less than a full degree because we have master programs of 1 year study. So it should be less than that, but minimum 1 ECTS credit. That's where we came up after our 2 years of discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we should then put the micro back in micro-credential in the sense that small learning, and you actually put a volume of learning in it, whereas I think in the European Commission definition it's that it doesn't have a volume of learning. So that's the difference between the project you've described, the microball project, and the official policy by the European Commission. But I would like to stay with the topic of credits, because we have a question from the chat to Thérèse, because you mentioned in your presentation there's a credit and non-credit credentials. And the question from the audience is, could you give an example of, well, credit credentials is clear, non-credit credentials I think is the difficult thing to imagine. Because if you and that's what the question says, I think accumulating a number of micro-credentials should be transferable as credits to be used in traditional degrees. So the question really is between the volume of learning, the value, the currency that you use, and then what can you use that currency for? So how do you spend it? Could you provide some examples, or is that not?
Yes, I mean, I think it's quite simple. What we could label as non-credit or non-credentialized units of learning are just all the pieces of learning that are not accounted for, or not granted an award or certificate or any other kind of credentialing mechanism at the end. I think at some places people might not hesitate in calling that non-formal education or learning, although also provided in a formal learning environment. I think that what's interesting here is to discuss that indeed all kind of micro-credential alike, let's say, forms should, now we're talking about the fact that there should be credits associated with them. Also, as I mentioned, in order to not create, let's say, two-speed kind of offers at higher education institutions, so some forms of learning that would be credited, and I never know if I should say credited or credentialized. It's not the same thing, but what I mean here is rather credentialized actually, and some others that are not. So yes, the question is really how much we want to put into trying to be clear and again transparent in how higher education institutions offer these, what they mean, and what the learner gets at the end as a certificate, as an award, as a badge, etc. Does that answer the question?
Well, I can't ask the person who asked the question directly because it was a question from the chat, but I hope so. I think it makes it clearer for me. Magalie, you want to add something?
Well, yes, I can also give an example here. In Flanders, we have universities who offer, of course, their regular programs, and everything is in ECTS credits there. But our universities, they also have a lifelong learning offer for people on the labor market, for people that want to specialize in a very small, specific field. And that offer does not fall under our national higher education legislation. So there they are much more free to offer some specific courses that do not relate to ECTS credits at this moment. And that's also one of the questions going on in Flanders, in the Flemish community. Do we have to officialize also this offer within higher education institutions? And what's the difference between this offer and other micro degrees, or what's in a name that higher education institutions are starting to offer now in the field of micro-credentials? Because these other ones are also falling under the definition of micro-credential, but they do not necessarily follow the same quality assurance procedures, ECTS, etc. And I think it's the same in other countries.
Yes. And here I was actually hoping that we would have a nice and easy discussion on a simple definition of what micro-credentials are, because I think it is actually, when you look at the definition provided by Kinga, out of the official documents by the EU, by the definition that you use for the microball, it is an easy definition, but what's underneath the definition are so many difficulties and questions. And I have one question from the chat which asks, at what point will we reach a clear definition of micro-credentials? I think that day will not come, if I may answer that question. I mean, we can agree on I think the approach that the European Commission has taken in the official, it's probably a valid statement that most of the world could subscribe to, but as we learned from the discussion here already this afternoon, it can mean completely different things. And if you bring in the question of what with providers outside of higher education realm, but still interacting with higher education, it becomes very complex. So I think the real challenge is to design our systems in lifelong learning manner and system. And actually, that was once the European approach that we provided for lifelong learning. Kinga, is this still a priority for the European Commission to look at? I mean, you mentioned it's an initiative by 2 commissioners looking at industry, labor, employment, and education. This lifelong learning approach, how does the European Commission drive this topic forward?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a crucial aspect of all policies. So this lifelong learning aspect is mentioned also in the European Strategy for Universities. It is part of the Digital Education Action Plan of the Commission, the Skills Agenda. So it is something that is part of the most important policy initiatives on this field. So there are also targets set, which are regularly monitored by the European Commission. So every year we publish a European Education and Training Monitor, where the performance of the different countries are showed by statistical data and analyzed towards the different European targets. So this is indeed that's on the spotlight, and that's a spotlight for our initiatives.
Thank
so
you.
also for micro-credentials.
Yes, and we will learn a little bit about the European University Initiative in the next session, because we have a speaker from one of the university alliances joining us and also presenting the work they are doing with that initiative on micro-credentials. So That will be the topic for after the coffee break, looking into concrete implementation within European University Alliances. Maybe for the Thai audience listening, one of the particularities in our European discussions is that the European Commission officially does not have the power to set regulations for education, because education, higher education, is the mandate and the competency of the member states of the European Union. But the European Commission has a very useful way of driving the policy agenda by peer learning and comparative approaches. So that's actually what drives education agendas in the European Union forward, that we compare, that we decide on a joint direction, and then we see how other member states are doing it, and that we learn from each other. And I think that's a very valuable approach, and I would recommend the ASEAN community also to take this type of peer learning approach by setting up this type of structures where you can learn from each other. Magalie.
Maybe I can add to that, because this is one of my other hats that I'm sometimes wearing, but in the Bologna process I'm also co-chairing the coordination group on global policy dialogue, and on all these topics within higher education, now micro-credentials, but also quality assurance and many other topics, internationalization, mobility. We are trying from the Bologna process also to reach out to other world regions, and not only at the time of our ministerial conferences in the European higher education area, where we invite also ministers from around the world, but also in between we are trying to seek for cooperation, for peer learning, for exchange with other world regions. So that's something that I'm trying to stress all the time, to find synergies, to cooperate between the Bologna process and, for example, Asia through the ASEAN process, but also through the global policy dialogue of the Bologna process.
And through SHARE, of course.
Of course.
Because you're also a regular guest at our events on the dialogue between the European Union and the ASEAN community in higher education. Last question, it was posed to Magalie, but I can ask it to everyone joining in here. What types of components do you consider essential for certified micro-credentials? So maybe broaden it, what do you think is the core of a micro-credential?
The elements, I mean, the European Commission has a nice list of elements that should be on a micro-credential. We have more or less the same within the microball projects. It's maybe phrased a little bit different, but it's the same, and it's really the basic information, the kind of what you could say as a diploma supplement, giving information about your regular degree. This certificate, this micro-credential certificate with different elements on that give information about the value of the micro-credential. That's also essential for any provider that delivers a micro-credential, I would say.
Okay. So the transparency aspect is...
Yes, that gives all the information about the value, about the size, about the quality assurance processes, the assessment methods, all these different kind of items that we need some information on to facilitate mobility, to facilitate recognition, and take up also for stackability reasons or for employers, whatever.
Okay. Thérèse, what do you consider to be the core, an essential element of a micro-credential?
Well, from the credential point of view, I think Magalie already said it all. We already have a quite clear list of what should be on a micro-credential to make it clear and also readable to the external world. I think from my more let's say education perspective, what is core to a micro-credential, but also to any kind of let's say units of learning is, and what should be clear is definitely what was the learning gain. what has been transformational in a way before and after taking that micro credential or any other kind of credential should definitely be clear. And the framework that was defined, and we already talked about that throughout the whole session, clearly puts the categories under which we can clarify that and make it clear for the external world what this micro credential actually provided in this regard.
Okay, thank you. So it needs to be transparent and it should demonstrate that learning takes place in that micro-credential. Also for those that haven't taken it, because I mean, that's part of the transparency promise that you actually provide open evidence that it's actually useful to take that course.
Okay, may I add one important thing? Also, this information about the micro-credentials should stay available over time, because that's also an important one for recognition in 10 years, for example. If it's a small micro-credential that is provided online and maybe it exists only for 2 years and then the information is gone about the micro-credential, that's also a very important aspect, that we keep track of everything at the moment that it's taken and that it can also be found later on.
Yes, very important aspect. Kinga, would you like to add one other core element? So we have transparency, we have demonstrated learning, we have a record over time. What else do we need? One more.
Yes, as Magalie has already mentioned, and also Thérèse, in this council recommendation we published, we have a list of standard elements to describe micro-credentials. It is indeed important to identify the learner, to identify the issuer clearly of the certificate, to describe the learning outcomes and the workload of this micro-credential. Here we expect use of the European credit transfer system for higher education micro-credentials. It's also important to describe very clearly where this micro-credential is placed. So what is the level and cycle, if applicable, in relation to the European qualifications framework, and also to describe how the assessment was made and what is the form of the learning, whether it was an online or physical or blended format of the learning. So these are also crucial for both the transparency and the portability of these micro-credentials, which is also a key principle for micro-credentials to be able to be shown in a different environment. So it should be portable among different types of education, so from vet to higher education, from education to labor market, but also geographically, so from one country to the other.
Thank you. I think portability is then my next key element that we need to consider, and that brings this session to a close. I think we are more or less on time, 3 minutes over time. We started 3 minutes late, so that's fine. I would like to thank the speakers, both here with me in cool Bangkok. We only have 33 degrees. I think Belgium had 40 degrees yesterday, so you should have come to Bangkok. It's nice and cool here, especially in this room where AC is on. But thank you for joining us this morning in Brussels. It was a pleasure seeing you and listening to you, and I hope you will follow further discussions of this seminar online. Can we give all the speakers a warm round of applause? I can't, the camera can show, can we show the room to the two speakers? Can you turn the camera and then that they can see who's actually applauding to them. So it's not just a virtual audience, it is a real audience in this room as well. And we've enjoyed this session and would like to thank you and have a nice rest of the day. And thank you, Magalie, and we'll talk over coffee.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Director Mikael and all the panelists for your productive discussion and all answers.